Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, we are now a few days post-release of Early Access for Path of Exile 2, and now that the game has been opened up to the masses and explored by hundreds of thousands of people already, as crazy as that is to say, people of course have their opinions about the game now, and within this time the developers have also made some updates of their own, some changes to the game, as well as talking about their thoughts a bit as well. And so today we're just going to wrap up all of the changes that have been made to the game since Early Access launch, as well as a lot of the community sentiments about the game so far in its current early access state, and with the majority of players still working their way through the first 3 acts of the campaign still as of this moment. Starting off with active changes that have been made then, there have been 9 hotfixes and a client patch since launch. For the most part, these are fixing smaller bugs or disabling certain microtransactions that were causing some sort of issues, but the actual player-facing important parts of these boil down to less performance issues, especially less crashing for people that were struggling with that. The supercharged slam skill had its damage reduced by a quite large amount, and 2 bosses within the Trial of Chaos had some slight damage reductions too. As well, the damage to the lightning runes from the Stormcaller rune modifier in the Trial of Chaos was reduced as well. Magnetic Salvos explosions have gotten their damage reduced a fairly large amount, and then in the proper client patch the largest changes were massive decreasing to gas grenade and gas arrows explosion damage, which originates with people sort of proccing these through flame wall to get near instant pops just proccing off for ridiculous amounts of damage over and over, but in the end this hits all builds that use gas arrow or gas grenade quite hard, as the damage of their explosion has just been heavily diminished. Everything else was more specific bug fixes or more fixes to crashing, but if you are, or at least were, using any of those skills that I just mentioned and have found them being less effective over the course of your journey, that's probably the reason why. Generally speaking then, the reports from the developers are that they don't want to over-nerf by any means, but some skills are just overperforming in completely unexpected ways to ridiculous degrees, and the developers are trying to nip this in the bud early before it gets too out of hand, before every player of a class is using the exact same things because nothing else is just anywhere close to as strong or worth using. That said, with that covered, there are a couple of potential bugs and a potentially unmarked change within the client patch as well. Since the client patch hit yesterday, a large amount of players are noticing at least what feels like an increase in the quantity of actual meaningful loot drops from proper enemies, especially rare and above items, and especially from killing rare enemies as well. The drop rates just seem way better. The developers didn't say that this was a thing in the patch notes, and it could entirely just be coincidental luck for a number of people on the day that the patch was applied. That doesn't really mean anything, but it is worth mentioning as a thing that could be going on, seeing as a lot of people just seem relatively convinced about it. Outside of this potential bugs, there have been players reporting not receiving their 5th and 6th ascendancy points when doing their trial activities on the higher difficulty levels for the first time. I am not at that point myself yet in progression. I just hit cruel difficulty yesterday, so I don't have personal experience to speak from. I don't know if this is affecting everyone or just some people, so let us know down in the comments below if you've either gotten your 5th and 6th points successfully, or if you think this bug has happened to you and you should have them but don't. The other one then is people thinking there is a bug with bonus maximum spirit not dropping from the King in the Mist boss in cruel difficulty Act 1. To my knowledge, this isn't dropping, but it also isn't supposed to. There are 2 sources of plus 30 spirit from the first 3 acts on regular difficulty, and the Bog Witch in Cruel Act 3 gives plus 40 maximum spirit, which will put you to a maximum of 100. The requirement for the highest spirit cost base persistent buff skills, so that does make sense. So some players are saying that there's a bug here, but I think this one is probably just a misunderstanding, personally. All that said, the remainder of what I want to talk about today is essentially just player reception to the game. The response from the community since early access launch, and a lot of the feedback that I've seen come up a lot, and hoping the devs catch at least some of it and potentially even act on it. The first main thing that was, well, coming up a lot before at least, was that rare gear and higher quality crafting materials just were not dropping in any sort of quantity. As mentioned earlier, some players do seem to think that the drop rates increased yesterday, but there's been no confirmation yet. The main issue here is not just when killing regular enemies out in the world though, but it's like things like coming across a higher quality chest in the wild, opening it up, and you get like white flasks with no modifiers, or defeating a boss that do beat the crap out of you for like 5 minutes and then getting a blue helmet that you don't even meet the stat requirements for. The game is difficult, right? We can all agree on that. It's not a pushover, and unless you are using the tippity top builds, a lot of bosses will kill you at least once or twice your first time seeing them, if not even more than that. So if when you do eventually get a kill after these bosses, after many attempts and fails, the actual reward just ends up being basically non-existent as far as a power increase, it just really stings. As for the difficulty of the game itself, I've seen a lot of feedback on both sides of the fence of this one. Some people love the challenge of even the early campaign acts that we have access to, and I'm included in that, honestly. Some people are just upset that you can't breeze through to the endgame in some random assortment of skills in a handful of hours. Everyone has preferences for this type of thing, people have different sort of likes and dislikes, but there are a few things that we can all agree on, I think, specifically not talking about the individual difficulty of like specific enemies or bosses or encounters, but just some base game design philosophies that we have here. The size of the actual maps and the zones that we progress through is a really big part of this, combined with the fact that if you die, all of the enemies on the map will reroll and respawn, and the fact that especially as you get further into Act 3, the checkpoints within each zone get farther and farther apart until you get to a point where you find yourself backtracking for minutes, make one mistake, die, and then basically get fully reset. And if there was any loot that dropped that you actually did want to get but you died before you could pick it up, that's also just gone now. The good side of this is that you still gain experience every time that you die, so if you do have to reprogress an area multiple times, you do technically slowly get stronger, you get gold, you get potentially loot, but this wraps around to the earlier issue that good loot just does not drop frequently enough to make the difficulty feel comparable. It makes it feel like a real slog to get the power increases that you need to make it feel actually completable. The game isn't inherently too challenging realistically, because if you have good equipment close to the level of the content you are doing, if you are kitted out in rares with perfect modifiers, it instead becomes easy. Obviously there's a fine line to ride where they want it to be satisfying without being frustrating, and the main thing that defines that is the quality of drops within the campaign, as well as the frequency of currency items, the crafting orbs, and specifically the regal and exalted orbs to get and roll for proper rare items along the way. On a similar note to this, on the same concept of the maps themselves being as big as they are, and the distance between checkpoints on them, base character move speed just feels a little bit too slow in general in many people's opinions, especially with one of the key parts of map clearing being managing large groups of enemies. Having lower movement speed than the enemies that you're up against really doesn't feel great, and it feels especially bad because the dodge roll that we have does not let you actually phase through your enemies either. It still respects their physical form, and those two things together make it easy to get very surrounded by enemies and just completely penned in, which is essentially just death unless you've got a shield, and it's precarious even if you do. Outside of this, there's just a lot of talk about the Trial of Chaos being completely overtuned, with people simply not being able to complete the first run of this within Act 3, even over-leveling their entry token by 6 or more levels unless they happen to hit a particularly favorable set of negative affixes and get the specific chamber with the statue escort mission, as that seems to be one of the easier ones. But there's been a lot of talk about this activity simply being far more difficult than it claims to be when you first look at the area level before going into it. To sort of sum it up then and condense it into the changes the community is asking for as a whole, it pretty much boils down to make all player characters just move faster as a base, make the dodge roll able to phase through enemies as an emergency option to help you get out of being surrounded, and then just increase loot quality and drop rates in general. Movement speed I think is something that definitely could be worth fiddling with, though my opinion on changing how the dodge roll works in that way is that when coming up with a dodge roll idea for a game like this, that is definitely something they considered. There's no way they didn't have conversations within the dev team about whether they wanted it to let you phase through enemies or not, and so unless the requests for that are very, very loud, very, very plentiful, just absolutely overwhelming, I really doubt that one will be changing to such a significant degree. As for drop increases, again, there are players claiming that they think this one has already happened, perhaps, but if so, the devs should just confirm it, because people wouldn't complain if they did increase the drop rates. All in all, really outside of some initial start time delays on early access launch and some rare disconnect issues, the game has had a really promising start in its release to the public in early access. Personally, I find the gameplay really just satisfying. I love the ideas behind a number of the mechanics and especially the activities. Personally, outside of the balance issues within them, I actually really do enjoy the Trials of Ascendancy as a concept, so I look forward to the more fleshed out versions of this in the endgame, as well as the other long-term content too. But of course, let me know your own thoughts on all of this down in the comments below. That just about does it for today then, a roundup of what's been going on over the past few days since early access launch for Path of Exile 2, and the general player response as well. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.